So welcome to everybody that has joined us today for this webinar. So I'm going to be taking you through the first part of the webinar, and my name is Kath, and you have spoken to Thomas. So Thomas, do you just want to introduce yourself to those people who have joined us just recently? Just say hi.
Absolutely. Good morning, colleagues. So my name is Thomas. I'm a learning designer in the Centre for Innovation Learning Teaching, and I'll be supporting Kath in today's webinar, although she really is the hypothesis expert.
Thanks, Thomas. Now, I think you're also pretty proficient on hypothesis, and that's why we're going to be chatting to you about this today. And as Thomas said, we're going to go through the basics. We are going to be taking a look at it as being used within Vula, but as someone has already mentioned in the text chat, this can be used online. There is an online version as well. So the principles are similar for both of those. So what we're going to be covering today is basically what is hypothesis, some use cases around hypothesis. We're then going to take a look at hypothesis in action. Then Thomas is going to take you through some of the features that can be used, which includes annotation, page notes, highlights, and grading. And then he's also going to show you how to get hypothesis into your Vula site so that you can use it in a really interesting and functional way. And then we are going to just touch briefly on actually creating a PDF resource that you can use within Vula that will work really well with hypothesis. So that is what we are going to cover today. If you have any questions as we're going along, please pop those into the text chat area. And we will pick up on those and answer those as we're going along. So thanks, everybody, and let's get started. So first of all, we're going to take a brief look at what hypothesis is. So basically, this tool is a very powerful annotation tool that integrates really easily with Vula. As we mentioned before, there is another version which you can use solely within a web browser. It is the same tool, but it functions slightly differently within Vula because it is integrated within the LMS in a slightly different way. So what this tool can do is it can annotate PDF documents and web pages. So the nuance about that is that these PDF documents or the web page that you're actually going to be annotating or applying the annotations to, it must be publicly accessible. And what that means is that hypothesis, because it is an external tool, hypothesis itself needs to have access to that resource that you're going to be applying the annotations to. So the resource cannot be in an area that requires an additional login or is behind an area where you have a paid subscription, because hypothesis would not be able to access that resource. So it's important to note that your resource, whether it's a PDF document or a web page, must be accessible by hypothesis. So the annotations that are made on these resources can be made private or visible to the whole Vula site. And people can actually reply or comment on these annotations. Obviously, they can reply and comment on the ones which are visible to the whole site. If you have kept annotations private to yourself, it literally is that. It's your own personal notes, and people will not be able to reply and comment on that because they can't see them. There's also a feature to highlight the text, and highlighting really is for yourself. Other people who are working on the resource at the same time will not see your highlights. So it really is just a personal study aid, and you can highlight certain parts, and you can also turn that highlighting on and off. And then lecturers can view all the contributions or filter by student. So a lecturer can see the full spectrum of all the comments and annotations that have been made on the resource, or you can use some of the features within Hypothesis to actually just filter a view where you can just see the annotations and replies and comments made by a particular student. And then you can also assign grades per student, not per annotation, it is per student. And this integrates really well with the Vula gradebook. So it's a very quick and neat and easy way to actually grade per student, not per annotation. And that will feed straight through into Vula gradebook. So basically, hypothesis is a way of making reading both active, visible, and social. So here's just some feedback that has been gathered from other use cases of hypothesis in terms of making reading active. We have someone saying here, I want students to learn the profits and pleasures of careful, engaged reading. Hypothesis finally delivers on the promise of digital annotation. And in terms of being visible, this person is commenting that I finally found a way to get students to read and engage with one another about their reading before class. And for making it social, someone has commented that hypothesis is my literary Facebook. When I'm reading, I sometimes wonder, does anyone actually understand this? Am I crazy? With this brilliant tool, I'm not alone. So you can see that by collaboratively all looking at a single resource and having the facility to highlight certain parts, make annotations, reply on those annotations, share ideas, thoughts, it actually makes it active, visible, and social. So now we're going to take a quick look at some of the use cases of hypothesis. So one way that you could actually use hypothesis is as teacher annotations. So in this way, what you could do is once you have your resource available and you have it into your Wooler site within hypothesis, you could actually pre-populate a text with questions for the students to reply to in the annotations. So in other words, you would load the resource up first, go in and actually make the annotations which are visible to the whole Wooler site. And in those annotations, you would be posing particular questions around the text that you had focused on and highlighted. And then you would invite the students to actually join the resource and actually respond and reply to the questions that you had actually posed on that particular resource. So in that way, you're using annotations to actually evoke a response from them and to actually gather their feedback through questioning. Another useful way to use hypothesis would be to use it as a glossary. So if you had particular terms that were used in your resource, you could let the students look up the difficult words or the unknown words to them and actually get them to put in their understanding of that word. And in that way, they're basically crowdsourcing from your Wooler site the students' input as to building up a glossary of all the specific terms that are going to be used within that resource. And because there is that reply feature, once somebody has put forward a definition of a particular term, remember that somebody else can also reply on that and comment. So somebody might say, my understanding of this word is ABC, and somebody may respond to that and say, yes, I agree with your ABC, but I think an important facet that you've missed is you also need to add DEF. So it's a very good way to actually test their understanding, make sure that they're getting to grips with the specific terms that are used in this resource, and also getting feedback from other students as well. Another way to use it is annotation as a question. So you can have the students to highlight and tag and annotate words or passages that are confusing them in the reading. So they could pose their question and say, I've read this 6 times and I'm still not quite understanding what this means. What am I missing here? What is it that is really being transmitted here? Can anybody please elaborate on this? And then you can get students or even yourself, obviously as the lecturer, to respond to those questions. So that's a way of using annotation as a way to test their knowledge and get them to pose questions, and also again for students to respond to that and lecturers to respond as well. Another way to use this will be annotation as close reading. So here you can have your students identify formal textual elements and broader social historical context at work in the specific passages. So it's a good way to really scrutinize specific parts of text that are within the resource at the time and to provide feedback on them. So really looking at the annotation in depth and in far more detail, and actually having a discussion about each of those elements that are used within the resource. Another way to use it would be annotation as rhetorical analysis. So here you could have your students mark and explain the use of rhetorical strategies in online articles or essays. So this could also work for other strategies that you might want to highlight or draw specific focus to. So get them to pick these elements out of a reading and actually elaborate on that in their annotations, and just remind them to always make those annotations available to the whole Vula site so that other students can actually respond and reply and comment on that. In that way, you're actually building up a discussion around the text. You could also use it as an opinion. So you could have your students share their personal opinion on a controversial topic that is being discussed in the article. So get them to focus on these particular aspects and actually share their opinions for further discussion about those aspects that appear. And the annotations within Hypothesis also support slightly formatted text, so you can include bulleting, italics, bold. It also supports links, so you can add in links to additional resources, and there are ways to include images as well. So you can actually use the annotations as a form of multimedia writing. So it doesn't just have to be completely text-based. You can actually link out to other elements, apply some formatting and a little bit of layout to your both the annotation and the responses, and include other elements as well. Another strategy may be to use it as an independent study. So here you could have your students exploring the internet on their own. Obviously, you would provide them with some guidance and direction as to how you would like them to accomplish this task. And they could actually find another article that actually linked to this. So in other words, find more information about the particular resource that you had shared, and using the hyperlinks and the formatting, basically link out and to find more broader information about this particular topic. And another interesting use of Hypothesis is to use it as an annotated bibliography. So once you have your resource shared, you could ask your students to research the topic and find additional supporting references and resources that actually link to this, and basically add those into the annotations as references. And in that way, you kind of crowdsourcing a broad set of bibliography around this to actually support the particular resource. And then finally, a way to use annotation as a creative act. So instead of having students responding just with text or links or bibliography or glossaries or answering questions, you can actually ask them to respond in a more creative way. So they could actually respond by putting in a short poem. So in other words, you could ask them, here is a resource, look at these particular sections, and now respond in a creative way by writing a short poem about the thoughts and emotions expressed in this particular part of the article. So the focus of the content that they actually put into Hypothesis can actually be broader than just answering a simple question or putting in a definition or finding a link or a bibliography, another text that actually supports it. They can actually write their short creative contributions as well. So now we're going to take a brief look at Hypothesis in action. So these are actual use cases where people have been using this with their students, particularly within the higher ed scenario. So here is an example of students, undergrad English students, where they've been annotating poems across the web. So remember that you can do websites, you can annotate websites, and you can also annotate PDF documents as well. So here's an example where they've accessed poems that are publicly accessible on the web, and they've done quite a lot of analysis. This is just a screenshot, but the annotations, as you can see, appear on the right-hand side in the pane, and there's quite a few more than what is visible here because this is just a screenshot of it. But this is a way to actually get your students involved and collaboratively commenting on poems on the web. Here's an example where students were directed to a particular Wikipedia page, and remember, it could be any publicly accessible web page, and they've gone through this page and annotated and provided feedback and insights on particular aspects on a Wikipedia page. Here's an example where students have been annotating a journal article. So remember that if you are going to go this route and access journal articles, they need to be publicly accessible, so they can't be behind a sort of area or in an area where there's a subscription applied. It needs to be accessible by hypothesis. So you either need to make sure that it is not in an area like that, a paid for subscription area, or you could potentially, depending on the rights of that particular journal article, you could actually put a copy of that into Vula itself. And Thomas will be showing you more about that later on. Here is an example where students have been annotating a novel. So they've actually gone through an entire novel that was available on the web and provided their feedback on this. Here's an interesting use of going through and annotating a Supreme Court opinions. So any kind of article or reference or resource document that you want to make available, students can effectively make annotations, comments, and reply on these. So an interesting use here is looking at these Supreme Court opinions. And on the next one, you will see that here it's actually being used to annotate a speech. So it's a good way to actually analyze and get feedback on speeches which are publicly available and to get people's feedback on that. So those were just some use cases, ways of using hypothesis. And most of them might be kind of known to you, or maybe they've sparked some ideas for you. But basically, it's to try and look at new ways to actually use this tool, which primarily latches onto text within the resource. But if you think to yourself that this text could be potentially maybe overlaid on top of something else, then maybe it will spark some creative ideas where you can actually use it on a resource that is not completely text-based. So the examples we've looked at have been fairly text-based, and it's been shown that you can include more multimedia in your responses to go beyond that and use hyperlinks and inclusion of images and things like that. But if you were to use a resource, for example, that potentially may have a diagram or an image as an underlying element, and then you had text on top of that, you could still get people to respond to the text, which then outlined the actual image. So Thomas is going to take you through a bit more of the features that are available with Hypothesis and how to implement this within Vula itself. Thanks, Thomas. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Kath. So yeah, Hypothesis is a pretty straightforward tool in terms of what it can do. It's actually quite nice and tight. The main features being annotation, highlighting, and page notes, and then grading for those who want to use it as a grading tool. We'll show you how to add Hypothesis to your site in a bit. We'll just go over those features to start. So the very first thing is, once you have added Hypothesis to your site and you've got it into your content, by selecting a section of text, you'll be prompted to either annotate or highlight it. We'll show you what highlights in a moment. Highlights are entirely private, whereas annotations, you can see, pulls up a little window on the right-hand side of the screen, where you will then provide your annotation, your primarily text-based annotation. These annotations are by default. If you see where the red 4 is, they are by default private, and by clicking on that little drop-down box, you can post to a group. In other words, the whole site, your entire Vula site. And of course, this is kind of the main benefit of Hypothesis, is that it's a collaborative publishing tool. Next slide. So here's just a little GIF of the annotation process. You can see select text, you annotate, and you type in whatever your particular annotation is. And you can see above, Sam has already done her own annotation, and we are now adding to that with an annotation of our own. So this is how you build up the conversation basically happening on a particular page. Very, very straightforward. Okay. Page notes, rather than being linked to a specific section of text, so an annotation, you select text and then annotate that particular piece. A page note rather applies to the whole document. And you can see to get to page notes, you in the top right of your little annotation window, you can switch between annotations and page notes. And page notes are most useful for the lecturer to provide instructions or particular guidance or something interesting about the text, basically something that applies to the entire piece of work rather than to a specific piece of text. Like your annotations, these can be applied specifically to post only to yourself or post it to the group. Generally speaking, you want to post to the group. People are able to reply to each other's public annotations. So all those annotations which have been made public, which, as you know, is the default. Well, it's not the default, but should be what you use. Anyone can then reply to those annotations just by clicking the little reply box on the side. And then, as per usual, you just type your answer, and you've got that small range of formatting options there in terms of bolding, underlining, etc. And here's just that animated GIF again, just showing you how to do that. In this case, Catherine is actually responding to her own annotation. You just click on the little arrow, type your answer, and post it, and then it comes up as a thread under that original annotation. Okay, next slide. Highlighting is a private-only aspect. So instead of annotating for public, you can highlight something for private, and this will be visible only to whoever is doing that highlighting process. For students to pick out things they want to look at later, for you to note that these are the areas that students should be replying to, but it's generally, as a student would highlight their own written text, it's a private endeavor. Next slide. And now when it comes to grading, so Lee, this one applied to you because this is only based on those hypothesis integrations within Vula. But if you've added hypothesis to your site by the mechanism we're going to show in a moment, next to the top left, there's a grading panel, and you can select all the different students who are on your course and apply a grade to those students. So you'd have to go read through all the annotations, check out, I guess possibly the page notes as well, check out who has provided what kind of feedback. And then the top right, we see the little red 3, you can give them a grade out of 10. Now, two things to note here. One is that, and here's just the animation of that process. The grade is out of 10, but in the grade book, it appears out of 100. So if you want to give them an 8.2, it's going to come out as 82 out of 100. In the grade book itself, you can go and edit that grade item to be whatever you want, out of 5 or 50 or 10 or so forth. But by default, in the tool, it grades out of 10. In the grade book, it displays as out of 100. The second point to note is that when you grade, you can't grade an individual comment. So you can't grade per submission or per annotation in a particular PDF or web page. You're grading on the entirety of the student's contributions to that particular resource. So just bear that in mind. You are grading on the whole thing and not sort of item by item. Okay, now looking at hypothesis in my Vula site. Now there are technically two ways. We are only going to show you the one way because it's much, much better than the other way. And this goes through the Vula lessons tool. So I know many of you were in yesterday's lessons webinar. To do so, you'd create your own lessons tool, your normal lessons page. And where appropriate, you would go to add content, add learning app. So that's just below the add resources, add subpage. In the add learning app window that will appear, you select hypothesis. And then you must give it a tool title. So you must name this particular hypothesis link. The name of the web page or web page assignment or PDF assignment or something like that. The name isn't particularly important, but you must give it a name, otherwise you won't be able to proceed. And once you have given a name, then you can click Save and move on to the next part. What's going to appear as, you can see in the top left, it appears as that little world icon with a little, the title that you've given it. You then need to click on Edit that, and it'll pull up the little editing window on the right. Click Inline and give it a height. However high you want it, really. Obviously, the longer you make it, the more space people can see without scrolling down to see either the text or the annotations. But that's entirely up to you. It doesn't have to be 1,500. It can be whatever the height you want it to be. And once you've done that, you click Update. Now, what's going to appear is, you see on the right, a window will appear in your particular lessons page. Sorry, on the left there, and it's going to ask you, prompt you to either select a URL or a PDF from Google Drive. Let's start with the URL. So if you have a public web page, now this is very important. Hypothesis is a server. It's like a layer which sits on top of something. So for Hypothesis to access that particular resource, be it a PDF or web page, it needs to be accessible to Hypothesis, which means it needs to be in the public. What that means is, if you have access to a specific server or database or so forth through, for example, your UCT credentials that Hypothesis doesn't have, you can add that URL and it won't come up, because Hypothesis needs to access that content as well. If you are ever stuck with websites and you're not sure if you are seeing this page because you have private access or it is in fact public, the best thing to do is to create a new incognito window in Chrome or a new private window in Firefox, because that new window treats you as if you had logged out of everything and all the secret stuff that you logged in as part of the UC community as well. And if you can still access that resource in your incognito browser or your private window browser, then it is a public resource. So if you have a PDF, you can click it, a URL, you just add it to that and click Submit, refresh the page, and then in your lessons page, there'll be this window to that web page with the Hypothesis overlay on top of it. And there you can see on the right, you can add your annotations or your page notes, as we have just shown you earlier. The process is pretty much the same for a public PDF. So we're talking about a PDF on a journal website or repository, bearing in mind again that those PDFs themselves need to be public resources. And you can check so by doing the method I just told you about, incognito or private windows. And yeah, bear in mind that a lot of stuff that's visible to you as a UCT lecturer is not visible to the world and Hypothesis. So always do check that you in fact can see the content as a public resource, not as something that you have access to as a UCT lecturer. The alternative to this process is to take your resource, your PDF, for example, and upload it to your own Wunapages resources folder. Kath, do we have a separate slide on that, or is that just
No, we don't have a separate slide.
Okay, cool. I'll just talk about that. So you download whatever PDF you need, or you upload a PDF from your computer, like a reading that you've created or something like that. Upload it to resources, but then you must make sure that that resource is a public resource. To do so, you need to move into your resources folder and okay, we don't. Oh no, we do. Okay, it's actually a bit later on.
Yeah, it's a bit later.
Can you go to slide 40? Since we're on the, so if you've added your PDF file to your resources folder, find that PDF, and then on the far right, you see there's that Actions tab. Click Edit Details, and make sure you have ticked this file is publicly viewable. That allows Hypothesis to access that file when it's doing its own annotation layer. So your files in your resources folder by definition are not publicly available. So you need to make sure that every file you upload is in fact publicly available if you want to do it from resources. Okay, going back to slide 38. Okay, Yeah. Now, we've been saying over and over again, PDFs or URLs, those are the only tools that, or only resources that Hypothesis can access. It has to be in a PDF format or as a web page, a freestanding web page. You can convert any resources that you create in the Microsoft Office suite, so Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., into PDFs quite easily. So once you've created your, let's say it's a Word document, you can save and save as PDF. In PowerPoint, I believe you export as PDF. Same process though, it's just creates a copy of it saves your original document and then creates a copy of that as a PDF document. That will produce a PDF, which is what you call OCR, optical character recognition, optimal character, something like that. But basically it means that Hypothesis can read the text on that PDF or document as text and not as an image, like the old school PDFs used to be. So long as you're using Microsoft Office, very easy process. You just save as PDF or export as PDF, depending on the program you're using. Upload that to resources, make sure it's publicly viewable, and go ahead with your process. Okay, next slide. That's where you just go.
Yeah, you've already chatted about that one.
Yeah, slide 41. Katharina, I do see your comment. I'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah, I think that's about all at the moment on that. So we're just going to skip forward to, here we go. If you are inspired to actually use Hypothesis, and the email address there, we have it, help@vula.uct.ac.za. If you have any further questions about the use of Hypothesis within Vula. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks so much to Thomas as well for taking us through all those features and getting it into the Vula site and for answering the questions in the text chat. And thanks also to Max, who's been in the background here as SILT Events for making this webinar possible and for sorting out the hosting and recording rights. Thanks very much to everybody and have a great day. Over to you, Thomas, just to bid everyone farewell.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, thanks so much, Kath, who is, like I said, our resident Hypothesis expert. And of course, big thanks to Max for making this all possible. Have lovely days, everyone. Best of luck for orientation and, have a fantastic 2021. Cheers.